This is apropos. Prosecutors in the US say the man accused of assassinating a Minnesota state lawmaker and shooting another will face federal murder charges, which could allow for the death penalty. They say the 57-year-old went to the homes of 3 other politicians before he succeeded in killing one of the targets of his carefully planned attack. With the latest on the investigation, here's Selena Sykes.
Flowers, candles and handwritten notes line the steps of Minnesota State Capitol as locals pay their respects to Democratic state lawmaker Melissa Hortman and her husband Mark, shot dead in their own home.
We've lost such a wonderful person in our government. She was doing so much for the families of Minnesota, and to lose her is tragic.
This is not what I've grown up believing. I think that we have a respect for democracy and that we shouldn't be utilizing political violence to make our point.
Vance Luther Bolter was arrested on Sunday evening after a 2-day manhunt and has been charged with 2 counts of murder. Investigators say the suspect passed himself off as a police officer when approaching his victims, and that it was clear that he had been planning the attacks for some time.
Bolter stalked his victims like prey. He researched his victims and their families. He used the internet and other tools to find their addresses and names, the names of their family members. He conducted surveillance of their homes and took notes.
57-year-old Bolter is also suspected of having shot and wounded Democratic State Senator John Hoffman and his wife Yvette. The couple, who are both now awake in hospital, were also attacked at their home, close to Melissa Hortman's residence. Prosecutors say Bolter went to the homes of 2 other lawmakers on the same night of the shootings. Police officers who searched his car found a list of more than 45 politicians, as well as several firearms and large quantities of ammunition.
The attack was the latest in a series of high-profile episodes of political violence across the United States. To discuss the wider consequences, let's bring in historian Matt Dallek, a professor of political management at George Washington University. Matt, thanks so much for being with us this evening. Are we seeing, first of all, more instances of political violence in the United States? Because it looks like if we look at the past 2 months alone, we've seen Israeli embassy staff killed in Washington, firebombing of a Colorado march, not to mention the assassination attempt not so long ago on Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, there are a lot of ways to measure it. So more than 9,000 threats against members of Congress, I believe, last year. More than some serious threats against federal judges last year. Threats are up against state legislators. And, remember, we had one of the largest episodes of mass political violence in decades on January 6th. And that was sandwiched in between attacks like the Charlottesville riots and the hammer attack on Paul Pelosi. So I think that, the decade that we're in the United States may be ultimately remembered as a violent decade akin to the 1960s and 70s.
And can you put your finger on why exactly that is? You've suggested previously that the usual norms are being torn up, that people who are carrying out these kinds of acts, they're being influenced by the current culture.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot that goes into it. So, one theory, and this I think is somewhat relevant today, one theory from the 1960s is that a rise in political violence was correlated with increased civil strife. Another theory is that when people grow cynical about government, they believe that it and other institutions are incapable of solving problems, maybe even a source of their oppression, they turn to the bullet. Social media leads to this fractured reality. Donald Trump, who, as you mentioned, is a victim of violence, but also an accelerant, his dehumanizing rhetoric, calling people scum and vermin, his talk about the enemy within, and then his pardon, for example, his actions, his pardon of the January 6 rioters who beat police officers. I think that those are just some of the reasons why, and decades of partisan polarization have fueled a bit of a perfect storm in which violence has become more endemic, more commonplace, really woven into the cultural fabric of the country.
Yeah, well, does that suggest then that US politics, it's always kind of had this violent undercurrent?
Well, yes and no. I mean, first of all, politics, and in this case, political violence, is never static. It ebbs and flows. So yes, there has almost always been some level of political violence throughout the American past. But, the country also transfers power peacefully most of the time. And the level of violence from the 1960s and early 70s was quite different from what the country experienced in the 1990s or the 2000s. So right now, I think we're in a time where the violence is more pronounced. It's got its own set of factors that are playing into it, that are factoring in. But certainly the country's experienced greater degrees of violence, such as the Civil War or the 3 assassinations of leaders in the 1960s.
And Matt, statistics suggest that the vast majority of more recent political killings they've been committed by right-wing extremists. How do you explain this? And also, what can be done about it?
Yeah. Well, I do think more of the violence in the current era is coming from the far right than the far left, although there certainly are acts of violence coming from the left. Well, what explains it? I think the conspiracy theories that have become popularized on the right. I mentioned Trump's role as an accelerant. He's really, in a sense, condoned violence at times. He's condemned it occasionally, but he condones it more than he condemns it. And I think the January 6th attacks, the big lie about the election, has sowed a kind of culture of violence on the right that doesn't quite exist in the same way on the left. In terms of what can be done about it, that's obviously extremely difficult. I imagine it's a kind of generational struggle of some kind. Restoring faith in institutions, regulating social media, having leaders that are far more aggressive about sending bipartisan signals, condemning violence, making more attempts at unity, and ending the wars, too, in the Middle East, which has also fueled some of the violence here at home in the United States. So those are a few things. Those are obviously, each of those is of tall order, but, this is the work probably of years or decades, not overnight.
And Matt, apart from the rhetoric that's being used by the likes of Donald Trump, how does his administration, the actual policies that it's implementing, how does that play into all of this? He's closed down, for example, specialist units focusing on investigating white supremacist extremism while pushing this anti-immigrant agenda.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. Look, first of all, I don't want to suggest that the Trump administration is in any way associated with the attacks in Minnesota. We just don't, we don't know enough, but it seems unlikely that there's any kind of direct link. But having said that, sure, Trump is not interested in tracking what are probably what most, I think, security experts considered a greater domestic threat, which is the threat of right-wing extremism. If anything, he pardoned members of the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. The aggressive use of the National Guard and even sending Marines into Los Angeles during the recent anti-immigrant protests. I think the heavy-handed ICE crackdowns, provoking some people into violence, which, of course, it's horrific on the right or the left, but I think we're seeing a more aggressive use of state power that also provokes a kind of reaction from extremists on the left who are willing to do violence. So I think there are different acts that have been taken, but we're only 6 months into Trump's second administration. It's still quite early, and we don't know exactly how all of this is going to shake out.
And Matt, after many of these attacks, what we tend to see is people being divided along political lines about who exactly was to blame. Why is there this polarization in the United States?
Yeah, well, that actually, I think you put your finger on one of the most disturbing elements, which is that an act of violence happens, And rather than most of the country coming together, figuring out a common fact pattern, understanding it, having a shared reality, and then condemning it, it's the opposite. So it splits apart. It's very easy on social media for individuals to spew conspiracy theories. They can take one shard of information and spin it up into something that is untethered to reality. I think that different people see political gain in blaming the other side and wanting to paint the other side as a greater threat to the country. And because politics, to answer your question, politics has become more apocalyptic. It has become more existential. And when it becomes more apocalyptic, the rhetoric gets out of control, and it is easier for each side, especially I think in this case the far right, to twist reality, to kind of turn it upside down and weaponize some of these events, as opposed to after January 6th, for example, saying, this was horrible, I never intended this, and these people need to be prosecuted. So I think that there's a political advantage that some political leaders see in exploiting these events, even if the facts themselves have nothing to do or almost nothing to do with reality.
Matt, thanks so much for that analysis and for your time in the programme this evening. That is Matt Dallek. He's a historian, also a professor of political management at George Washington